Nothing stays the same forever. Be it the talent, consumers, or an industry, there is bound to be a shift in one of these that serve to forecast the future. It's a universal truth that fills people with unease, and rightfully so. But we're not here to get existential, we're here to talk about Call of Duty. Not many franchises in gaming have had the cultural influence this one has had. Whether it's family or friends, someone you know has an attachment to this brand, which is a testament to what this series represents and its mass market appeal, the latter of which became a focus for developers and publishers during the time when first-person shooters exploded into the console market. And it was during this exact period that this brand saw massive successes, questionable releases, and a redefinition of the series. It can be easy for some to write off every Call of Duty game post Modern Warfare 3 as simply bad and leave it at that. But this video isn't about that, nor is it about deriding all of Call of Duty. Releases such as Ghosts and Advanced Warfare only frustrate me because of what they stand to represent, rather than their production value. As unsavory as it may seem, the games themselves are merely a result of attitudes changing amongst consumers. That's not to say that players asked for Call of Duty's formula to be mutated and mishandled. To the degree that it has been. Call of Duty's foundation was built to have the player immersed in war as a grounded first-person shooter, with the goal of emulating humanity's bloodiest conflict, which is what made the campaign an integral part of the experience, and while the multiplayer existed, it wasn't the franchise staple it is today. But over time, the franchise's signature design has been repurposed in ways it was never intended. Some changes have enhanced the experience, some changes directly contradict it. Whether these changes were an attempt at variety or an attempt to avoid stagnation is unclear, but the reality is these alterations to the formula have had a profound effect on story and gameplay, so much so that these changes have gone on to define an entire release's identity. To demonstrate, we need to go back to the early 2000s. Infinity Ward released Call of Duty for the PC in 2003. It was a World War II FPS, not unlike the hundreds of games that have captured this setting and atmosphere. But unlike others, and similar to some, Call of Duty's goal was to utilize the framework of an arcade shooter to allow for accessible pick-up and play action that wouldn't be hamstrung by the limitations of tactical shooters. Emulating battlefields was a top priority, but developers weren't striving for realism, they were striving for a sense of relentless bombardment and synergy between the player and non-player characters, to capture the brutality of humanity's bloodiest conflict. You were just as vulnerable as your allies. You rarely fought in a group of less than 4 soldiers, survival wasn't guaranteed, and missions became more challenging as your fellow soldiers began to die. But the knowledge that supporting your allies in combat to prolong their survival only helped to make the experience richer. Infinity Ward followed up this success in 2005 with Call of Duty 2, a title that retained the prequel's core gameplay, but with adjustments to health and level design to make for a more accessible and engaging experience. It was a strong sequel that solidified Call of Duty's place as serious competition against franchises such as Battlefield and Medal of Honor. But in wanting to keep the interest of players as high as possible, Activision tasked Treyarch to develop a sequel to Call of Duty 2 immediately after release. After releasing Big Red 1 in 2005, Treyarch released Call of Duty 3 in 2006, a title that followed the trend of a World War II FPS, identical to Infinity Ward's output. But while the first and second games achieved their power through gameplay, Call of Duty 3 achieved its power through characters and story, that evolved as the conflict progresses. Modern Warfare was the first time the series broke away from its World War II setting, exploring conflicts in a world similar to our own as you fight in conflicts across the Middle East and Russia, taking the role of the US Marines and the SAS throughout the story. But despite its inception as a World War II FPS, adhering to the constraints of the franchise's core design was still possible, without limiting its storytelling and gameplay potential. The franchise would explore World War II once again in World at War, but with a longer development time of 2 years rather than Call of Duty 3's 8 months, Treyarch were able to craft a signature sound and style that is unlike anything the franchise had seen prior. By this point, Call of Duty had found its place in the market, offering a gameplay experience that was gritty and graphic. The franchise had never wavered from its focus to immerse the player in war. But there was still a problem. These games achieved their power by having the player be of similar strength to their AI companions. But outside of a name and face, there wasn't much to connect these soldiers to the player, which only puts more pressure on the narrative to make up for it. This wasn't so much an issue at the time, but in retrospect, it's likely to bore those who are looking for a richer experience. But the modern setting had granted developers freedom to explore stories, conflicts, and characters that wouldn't be possible in a pre-modern conflict. There was a vacancy for a strong protagonist, or a strong narrative for players to attach themselves to. To achieve this, a shift in focus would be necessary, not just in setting, but in story. Modern Warfare 2 marked the beginning of a franchise on the path to redefinition. Gameplay that depicted you as a soldier on the battlefield had been repurposed to pit you as a one-man army, surviving against impossible odds. It made for one of the most high-octane Call of Duty campaigns in franchise history, and this was consistent across the campaign and multiplayer during the 2010s. As Black Ops, Modern Warfare 3, Black Ops 2, and Ghosts would steadily build upon what came before, but not all alterations produced ideal results. In previous games, your survival in missions was cleverly masked by the conditions required to complete each level. This infiltration is only possible because there are two of you. This assault is only possible because you have an army supporting you. But to add greater stakes, the designers and writers had to raise the tension during missions. However, they also needed to maintain Call of Duty's identity as a military shooter. The solution is the video game equivalent of having your cake and eating it too. To achieve this, your role as the soldier has been replaced with your role as the action hero. The result is a conflict between story and gameplay, where the story sets up gameplay twists in a manner that wouldn't be logically possible. These inconsistencies range from relatively unnoticeable to unabashedly ridiculous, and can only really be masked by the quality of the writing. And because these sections have stripped back the gameplay so much, it's akin to watching a cutscene or a QuickTime event play out. However, in fairness, it's moments like these that have enhanced the drama. There is a reason why these games all have you confronting the antagonist directly in a final struggle, but this issue in design permeates almost every release since World at War. And while I'll admit I and many others are satisfied with the results, I can't help but wonder if this change was the only way to achieve this result, especially since it came at the cost of a more dynamic gameplay sandbox. Speaking of gameplay, it's time for a change. When looking back on Call of Duty's leap forward into the future, it's hard not to be disappointed, but that is only when viewing in retrospective. At the time, Advanced Warfare's announcement was met with a very positive reception. Concerns now were more to do with what developers were going to bring to the table, which was indicative of the fanbase's desperation for a fresh take on the series. Regardless of its execution, Advanced Warfare set the standard for enhanced mobility, but contained levels that were so restrictive, it failed to encourage players to properly utilize these enhancements, beyond the game forcing you to do so. And because they lacked versatility, their usage mirrored the QuickTime events found in prior installments. Black Ops 3 opened things up with larger levels, enemy variety, and flexibility to select your loadout before missions. And the story explicitly established your role as a super soldier. And Infinite Warfare pushed the series even further into the future, while maintaining all of the game balance present in Black Ops 3. And these changes to gameplay build upon themselves to make for a cohesive experience, but instead contains a story that acknowledges players instead of ignores them. And while the story runs into some issues, the writing is strong enough to allow the player enough time to connect to the game's ship and crew, unlike in previous games. These stories are now more believable because they recognize your character as the super soldier, instead of you and your allies being able to survive insane scenarios, because the plot demands it. As a result, there is synergy between your role as the protagonist and the alterations to gameplay, effectively reinforcing your place in the world. But because these mechanics haven't been properly integrated with Call of Duty's gameplay loop, these changes feel unnecessarily tacked on. The praise flexible loadouts and progression systems receive is unwarranted, as these changes only represent the desire to unify the experience across campaign, multiplayer, and zombies. The franchise has never had an issue with loadouts or progression previously. However, what has been lacking is player agency. The cinematic approach that was popularized with Black Ops 2 has bled into every release since, with Advanced Warfare and World War II being some of the worst offenders. Playing Infinite Warfare and World War II back-to-back confirmed a theory I'd had for a while, that, for all of the issues these games have in story, nothing compares to playing a game that consistently takes control away from you in order to commit to its cinematic style. A commitment that wasn't necessary, especially since it was only 1 year after World War II's release that Infinity Ward proved how to have a cinematic experience while building upon the franchise's signature foundation. To say Call of Duty was on Struggle Street wouldn't be entirely accurate. Sales and critical reception for Call of Duty titles has never truly been abysmal, but longtime fans were starting to feel the fatigue, even in multiplayer. By this point, Call of Duty was a multiplayer shooter first and foremost, that just happened to have a campaign and zombies mode, for those who wanted a break from the feature creep, which might have been why the announcement of a Modern Warfare reboot excited so many people. The original Modern Warfare left a mark on both the franchise and the industry, and while lightning rarely strikes twice, a reboot of the original presented an opportunity to re-establish Call of Duty's identity. And suffice to say, it was well worth the effort. Modern Warfare 2019 offered an experience that wasn't just grounded and gritty, but it was also authentic and heartfelt. Farah's desire to rid her country of foreign occupation, Alex's longing to fight for a cause that he believes in, and Captain Price's mentorship of Gaz don't exist just to move the plot forward to a climactic moment, because enough time has been spent with these characters in and outside of gameplay to make for authentic interactions, and this authenticity extends to the levels themselves. It is a real task to craft missions with scripted and non-scripted encounters, but to craft levels with as much attention to detail as Clean House, the Embassy, and the Wolf's Den speaks volumes to the amount of effort that has been put in, all to make Modern Warfare's world feel like a real place, and without sacrificing player agency. Call of Duty seemingly had a bright future ahead. Modern Warfare 2019 was the adrenaline shot the series desperately needed, and was seemingly an acknowledgement that the trajectory the brand was on was going to sink them into the Atlantic. It's a shame that despite all efforts, the franchise appears to be approaching the iceberg even faster. A very common criticism these games receive is that developers simply recycle the same game every year, but I think that's primarily to do with the perception of multiplayer. The reality is multiplayer can only evolve in the form of changes to weapons, maps, and modes. And while your multiplayer offerings incorporate a live service model, while sharing more similarities than differences in each release, players are only going to gravitate towards the title with the highest player count, effectively reinforcing the stereotype. Black Ops Cold War was written off as being mediocre as it was too afraid to take risks in multiplayer, and the campaign regressed in storytelling. Vanguard proved to everyone that Sledgehammer probably should have stayed as a support studio. Modern Warfare 2022 found some success in its campaign, but the multiplayer disappointed players with its lack of support and poor map design. Modern Warfare 2023 was burned alive for having one of the worst campaigns in franchise history with virtually unchanged multiplayer. And Black Ops 6 has a campaign that's just as sloppy as Cold War's, with some of the worst maps in multiplayer history, and has decided to take credit for adding back features that shouldn't have been removed in the first place. Despite my criticisms, going back and playing all of these games was a very enjoyable experience. This isn't a series I despise, as a matter of fact, quite the opposite, which is why it pains me to see the direction it's heading in. Call of Duty's move from grounded military shooter to action movie with Modern Warfare 2 was done for the sake of storytelling, and while sacrifices were made, it was ultimately a decision that was well worth the risk. Ghosts looked like we could be staring at the beginning of the end of the franchise, but they managed to pull themselves out of the muck, but not by building upon the franchise's foundation, but by mutating it into a futuristic shooter and incorporating microtransactions into multiplayer. And now, the franchise has perfected the model for absolute player retention. But at the end of the day, it's impossible to deny its success. And while I'm not in favor of this behavior as a consumer, I can't argue with the results. Nothing stays the same forever, but I lament how this franchise continues to squander its potential to be something more. Not because it should be, but because it could be. And maybe, just maybe, it still can be.